So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar being sponsored by the American Water Works Association. You're joining us today for a webinar on getting the lead out, the legal issues in EPA's lead and copper rule. And this is part of what is the AWWA legal community virtual roundtable dialogue, a new effort by the AWWA, both to bring together its legal community and, in a coronavirus world, putting more pressure on to do this virtually rather than potentially in person. There are a group of sponsors today for today's event that and for a number of the webinars. We'd like to acknowledge them: Woodard and Curran, Logistic Environment, Emmy Simpson, and Napoli Shikolnik. I'm Ron Tempest. I am a partner at Vinson Elkins, a law firm law firm with offices in many locations. I happen to be in Washington, D.C., and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. A couple of just introductory things on enhancing the webinar experience. If you can close your email, instant messages, any other programs not currently in use, that will help because those can interfere with the smooth reception of the webinar. If you are in need of technical assistance, you find yourself with some difficulties, that can be found at the GoToWebinar technical support page. It's on the link listed and in your materials and on the slide shown. One other just thing on that, one quick point. As you can probably have a sense, all of our participants are working from unusual home locations, not maybe necessarily in our standard business circumstances. So if you happen to get entertained with a barking dog, a ringing doorbell, a small child who decides to help us all out with a little bonus entertainment, just know no extra charge for that. It comes to you free for your laughing and entertainment. We hope to avoid those things, but obviously appreciate your understanding if we run into a small bit of extra content here that we weren't anticipating. So let's see, moving on. There is going to be a survey at the point we wrap up today. I know that the AWWA in particular, as would your panelists, would really appreciate any feedback you might have at that point. Really valuable for the AWWA as it tries to understand what services and programming is useful to all of you as its valued members. I think that covers pretty much the introductory logistics. So, of course, the standard disclaimer about that you get on commercials and things. If there are any mention of specific products or services in this webinar, that doesn't represent an AWWA endorsement, nor are the opinions expressed here today necessarily reflective of the views of the AWWA. AWWA does not endorse or approve particular products or services. Gosh, you would have thought that important legal disclaimer would have been the first thing that your lawyer host would have jumped to add here. So that does take care of the initial logistics. Let's talk a little bit just about who we have today, and in particular, the panel we've put together here. You can see everybody's shining photos there, but a little bit more first on background of the team who will be presenting today. First, I guess, as to myself, again, my name's Ron Tempest. I am a partner in the law firm of Vinson Elkins. A good deal of my practice focuses on environmental law and environmental regulation, and in particular have for a number of years been the primary outside lawyer who has assisted the AWWA when it comes to things like commenting on proposed rulemakings that you see periodically from the EPA. I also do a variety of work helping various clients when they have environmental investigations, need regulatory counseling, have matters where the government thinks something has gone amiss and is potentially investigating and or looking for some way to resolve those concerns. Next, we have Spencer Bruce. One of the great things today is we're going to have the insight and experience of people really in the business and who can bring to us real insight on what were the things they're focused on and attending to in connection with this proposed rule. Spencer is the president and CEO of the Louisville Water Company. Louisville Water goes back to 1860. It's the largest water utility in Kentucky, serves more than 850,000 people in the Louisville metropolitan area and surrounding communities. He joined Louisville Water in 2006. Has had a variety of duties there, including managing the company's distribution operations and water treatment facilities. He served as the company's vice president and chief engineer from 2013 until early in 2016. Prior to being at Louisville Water, Spencer worked with Roun in multiple management positions related to maintenance, production, engineering, customer service, and supply chain. He's got 23 years of engineering and management experience. He has a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering from the University of Kentucky. And of course, he is a professional licensed engineer. Next, we have Sean Bunting. Since February of 2015, Sean has been the vice president and deputy general counsel of American Water. I guess American Water and Louisville are in a bit of a race to claim to ancient lineage. Poor American Water only goes back to 1886 compared to Louisville Water's claim back to 1860. So a mere child in this field. American Water is the largest and most geographically diverse of the U.S. publicly traded water and wastewater utility companies. It employs more than 6,800 professionals, providing both regulated and market-based drinking water, wastewater, and other services to more than 15 million people in 46 states. Sean leads a legal and compliance team of more than 50 professionals involved in the day-to-day legal services essential to the company's operations. He joined American Water in 2008 as vice president and general counsel of its market-based business. Has led American Water's concession team from 2009 to 2012. Also has served as general counsel for various of its regional areas, including the Mid-Atlantic and Eastern divisions, and including the two largest state subsidiaries within their system for Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Before coming to American Water, he was an assistant general counsel at Allegheny Energy, and also previously worked for the law firm of K&L Gates. Finally, we have Corinne Snow. Corinne is a colleague of mine. She is a counsel in the Environment and Natural Resources Group at the Vinson Elkins law firm. She has held a number of positions in the government at the U.S. Department of Justice. Most recently, she was counsel and chief of staff in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division there, where she assisted managing a 600-person division with 400 lawyers. That is a group that is responsible for representing the various United States agencies in all of the major environmental litigation that goes on across the country. The DOJ is essentially the outside counsel that every federal agency has to use and hire when they're involved in litigation in federal courts. She's personally argued multiple cases in the courts of appeals. She's a graduate from Vandy and Harvard Law School, and previously was a clerk on the Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit. So that's the background of your group here. I think we want to start today with a bit of just level setting about where are we at. We'll go through, offer some opening comments and background. Then, so you'll be hearing from a bit from each of us. There is question and answer available. There is, if you look at your login, there is an option for you to submit questions. We won't have audio capability for that, but if you want to type in and send a question, particularly if you want to identify for the general group or for a particular panelist, you can do that. We'll be monitoring that. So we're going to begin with some initial roundtable, presentations, then proceed to some question and answer for the second half. So that's the plan. Why don't we start with just, as I say, some level setting about the lead and copper rule overview, kind of both quick hitter on kind of procedurally where this stands and what is going on within the rulemaking process. And then we'll try to hit, again, very quickly, a handful of what we think are some of the most pertinent areas, particularly for this group today. I should say the rule is a beast. A lot of pages, a lot of complexity, and one of the things we are not trying to do within this group today is to be water engineers. There are a variety of complicated issues within the rule that you might put into the category of operational nuts and bolts that are clearly going to be important if this rule is finalized. If that's your interest, well, I hate to tell you, you probably got the wrong webinar. I think AWWA has in mind to do some additional programming for that kind of what you might call the engineering sciencey part of your operations. We're trying to today focus a little bit on sort of the topics that we think are of big picture interest in the C-suite and within that also particularly to folks who are in the legal and kind of big picture compliance function seats. So that's our overview is going to kind of focus on some of the most pertinent aspects with the idea that that's the audience we're trying to help here today. So why don't we go ahead one slide. Just in terms of some basic background and timeline. We'll have a little more detail on this, but this is condensing a complicated, basically 30-year history into 2 or 3 bullet points, focusing on kind of a couple of the most pertinent points to the story as to why we're here today. Just looking back in time, lead and copper related issues as they relate to drinking water have been a matter of federal regulatory concern and attention for really, in excess of 3 decades now. At least one way to get through that narrative is to focus on 1991 as the point where there was a first major rule, the lead and copper rule that begins to serve as the foundation for where we are today. There was a lot that happened in the intervening 27 years that you see on this slide, for which there's not a single bullet point. We'll show you some stuff later that maybe shows you all of the things we're aligning with this slide. But all to say, a variety of starts and stops on potential additional rulemaking, various studies, proposals, a lot that happened there, but that ultimately then culminated in sort of 2 things that are most significant in the recent history. December of 2018, the current administration announced a federal action plan to reduce childhood lead exposure and associated health impacts. And that a piece of that overall plan then included the proposal for updates and changes to the lead and copper rule. That proposed rule came out November 13th of 2019. And let me just talk a little bit there about sort of federal rulemaking and where we are as a result. when agencies like EPA want to make changes to regulations, there is a kind of very specific process they need to go through to do that. It's governed in federal law by something called the Administrative Procedures Act. So in essence, they have to first publish and propose a set of changes, including kind of the detailed regulatory text, what the new regulations would say, and they put that out for public comment. And that gives all of those who care about the proposed rule from whatever dimension an opportunity to evaluate the proposal and put in comments and respond to any explanations the agency has given for the reasons they want to make the changes. So that is it is that formal proposal that you see reflected here as of having occurred on November 13, 2019. As I mentioned, there's always a lot of run up to something as major as this that goes on over a number of years. But you get that formal proposal, and then that gives the public an opportunity to comment. In this case, as AWWA, as part of its role in advocating and guarding the interests of its members, AWWA filed a 148-page comment letter proposing various ways that EPA might improve the rule, make adjustments, and with an eye towards making the end product more workable for the systems that will potentially face the new requirements. So look, I'm not the president or a manager or executive within AWWA, but just bluntly, that's part of something like this is a major effort, and it's part of what really AWWA is able to do is for you all is when you get a major proposal like this, it can gather the collective wisdom within your community. They can put together a comprehensive set of comments so that individual water groups need to do that each individually and save you all, I think, money and resources in trying to get improvements on what is nevertheless a major development for you. As I mentioned, we helped AWWA prepare its comments, and with 148 pages, we're certainly not going to capture all of the comments and concerns reflected there. But let me, before we dive into the handful that we think are probably most pertinent today, I mean, just to give you a flavor of the range of issues that are addressed within that letter, some things that were in there that we aren't going to hit today, but give you a quick flavor, were comments on what are the best sampling techniques and frequencies for tap sampling. How sound is the science linking lead exposure to heart disease and IQ impacts, which is an important part of where and how they set certain triggers. What are some of the special challenges and burdens that the rule would present for small systems? And then my favorite in terms of maybe giving you a sense of how in the weeds and technical some of this, has EPA modeled and calculated correctly the new costs of the rule that the new rule will impose, including whether pharmacokinetic modeling is adequate to support cost-benefit analysis? So you're not going to hear about any of those things today. I just flagged them as a way of giving some illustration of the range and breadth of the kinds of issues that both this rule embraces and that AWWA prepared comments on. So we've had that comment period. It has closed. AWWA's comments are in, as well as those of a bunch of others. I'm going to flip it to Corinne at this point, who will talk with that by way of setup, where we think we're at in real time in terms of what we're hearing both formally and speculating a bit about informally. So Corinne, you want to take it next?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So we were hoping today to have a final rule to get to talk to you about so we could tell you about what's actually in it. but it hasn't come out yet. We know that it has gone to a part of the White House that has to review all major rules before they come out, called the Office of Management and Budget. We've been told informally at this point it probably won't come out until after the election, but really at this point it could come out at any time. Now, when it does come out, it's going to include what's called an effective date. So it won't go into place and you won't be responsible for those requirements the day it's published. There will be at least 30 days, but maybe more, before the requirements set in. And that's also not the end of the story, because this rule is almost certainly going to get challenged in court. This is the kind of space where EPA is not going to be able to make anybody happy, probably. There's going to be groups who think they should have done a lot more and groups who think they should have done a lot less. And so we'll expect to see a challenge in the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. Groups will have 45 days after the rule is published to go to that court. And that's where the comments that Ron was talking about earlier will really matter, because those comments help to make up the body of information that a court is allowed to look at when it decides whether or not what EPA did was lawful when they put out this rule. And if nobody brought up certain arguments against the rule during that comment period, they can't bring them up in the court case. When this gets to court, the court could possibly stop the rule from going into effect while it's still considering the rule, or it could allow those requirements to go into place while it's considering the rule, and then we'll have to wait and see what happens in that court case. So there's going to be a little bit of uncertainty in the period of time right after the rule comes out about whether or not you immediately have to comply with any of those requirements and how long they'll actually stand. But for today's purposes, we thought we'd at least talk about what we'd expect to see in that final rule based on what we've seen in the proposal. And I'll turn it back to Ron to start talking about what that looks like.
Thanks, Corinne. So picking up on that, yeah, I guess I'll emphasize just that one point here. We're talking here today about the proposal. Obviously, there were a lot of comments from different quarters about things that should be changed, either to be made more practical and workable, or frankly, to people who feel like it is perhaps not tough enough, doesn't go far enough, more needs to be done. And so it seems unlikely in a rule of this magnitude that nothing will change from the proposal. Unfortunately, we don't have the crystal ball to guess exactly, will there be major changes or are they going to be tweaks around the edges? So we are, doing the best we can to help people focus on this and begin to prepare, knowing that we've got kind of 6 major topics here we're going to speak to. Any one of them could see a major revamp, could disappear, or could emerge basically exactly as we're describing it now. So we're sorry that we don't have more certainty, but why don't we at least start with the proposals likely to be pretty close to where they end up in most respects, and so we're going to work from that assumption. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk here just for a few more minutes and then really get on to Spencer and Sean by way of setting the groundwork around kind of 6 major elements. And at least one way to think of that maybe is the first 3 we're going to talk about maybe go in some big way or bucket to kind of new major operational obligations. In terms of really running running the pipes, repairing the pipes, that kind of thing. The second 3 we're going to talk about, you might broadly think of in the bucket around communications and interfacing with the public about this. And we put it in those terms because there is certainly a part of what is going on here, and I think is evolved for EPA over time as they thought about these issues, is that second bucket becoming more and more a part of their thinking, that their EPA's role as regulator is not just about ensuring, that certain parts per billion are not exceeded in water, but also that its role is to direct and ensure that that you are communicating with your customers in certain ways and are becoming the vehicle by which public education about risks and options for dealing with pipes in a house, for example, are communicated. And so we're going to at least broadly sort of put these 6 major pieces we want to talk about into those 2 big picture buckets. So first 2 of the 3 you see on this slide relate to corrosion control and line replacements. And big picture within that, a lot of this operates around now, if you hit through various sampling, you hit a 10 parts per billion trigger level, there are going to be requirements. This is a big picture way of capturing this is in terms of change. It's oversimplifying a little bit, but basically the regime has been built around an action level at 15 parts per billion. So a set of things that had to be done if a certain amount of sampling was showing up at that level. Conceptually, a new part here is this trigger level of 10 parts per billion that begins to trigger kind of a set of proactive steps. So, broadly, at this trigger level, if you're already treating for corrosion, you're going to have to go back and try to re-optimize that. If you're not currently treating within your system for corrosion, if you hit this 10 ppb, you're going to have to do corrosion control study so that you are ready to then respond and re-optimize. There are some changes also within this that are linked to system size, so people will need to be kind of mindful of that. And then there are sort of find and fix requirements that are going to be associated with hitting a 15 micrograms per liter trigger that involve things like collecting follow-up samples at locations that came in higher than the 15, do water quality parameters monitoring at or near sites that tested higher than the 15, and then follow on corrective action. AWWA put in a variety of comments on this and others, noting concerns about this has a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to corrosion control. Argued that EPA's overall approach ought to be a little bit more offer up a toolbox of approaches and from which folks can choose to sort out what will be best for them and most fit the needs and uniqueness of each individual system. Line replacement that you see here also mentioned. There are requirements for water systems to replace the water system owned portion of the lead service line when a customer now would choose to replace their own customer owned portion of that line. Systems with known or possible lead service lines are going to have to develop, lead service line replacement plans. You're going to have to conduct outreach and initiate lead service line replacement when you see testing above this 10 parts per billion kind of trigger level. And there are, a variety of more detailed requirements within that. At 10 parts per billion, you have to work with your state to set an annual goal for replacing lead service lines. If you're above 15, you're going to have to be involved in fully replacing a minimum of 3% of the number of known lines. There are proposed prohibitions on partial lead service line replacements, except for very narrow circumstances like an emergency replacement. there will be requirements related to, in the course of the lead service line replacement, after the fact, providing filters and cartridges for customers for the period after replacement, follow-up lead tap sampling at locations in the following month, and another probably important piece compared to some of the features people have been able to draw on previously. In up until now, in terms of some of the lead service line replacement requirements and meeting certain targets, you could count as a lead service line replacement events where you successfully tested out. You did some testing and were able to rule out certain locations. You could sometimes, in certain circumstances, count that towards meeting your 7% mandatory replacement rate. So some things like that would potentially go away. So those are a couple there around those, big picture. Why don't we flip to the next slide here? I think we've talked about, then we've got requirements related to lead service line inventories that you can see here. Probably don't need to spend a lot more time on those. You can see some of the major action items here and changes that we're going to experience there in terms of having an inventory and maintaining an inventory. Corinne, do you want to take over at this point?
Sure. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there's going to be some changes, at least from what we can see under the proposed rule, to procedures for sampling, how systems select where they're going to sample, and also the frequency of sampling. So under the current rule, there's a priority for sites that are serviced by copper pipe with lead solder installed after 1982. And currently the rule requires systems to collect 50% of their samples from lead service lines if they're available. Under the new rule, there would be prioritization for lead service lines, and 100% of the sampling would have to be from areas serviced by lead service lines if they're available. The new rule also proposes some minor changes, as you can see on this slide, to the way that sampling is done, including using wide mouth bottles. And there's also proposed changes for the frequency of testing, which would depend on the trigger levels of lead in the system as opposed to the system size. So at higher levels, you'd be required to do more frequent sampling and sampling at additional locations. And under the current rule, all sampling is for lead and copper, but under the new rule, at least as proposed, it's possible that you would have to do additional sampling just for lead, sort of based on the amount of lead that was in your system at different levels. So there's also going to be some additional notification requirements, at least based on how it's been proposed. Before, customers were notified of their tap sampling results in writing, by mail, or by another method if the state allowed for it, within 30 days of those results coming out. And those requirements are still proposed to be kept in the new rule, but there'd be an additional requirement that if the lead levels for a particular sample at a home were above the 15 parts per million action level, that you would have to then let that home know within 24 hours. And that notification would either have to be electronic or by a phone call rather than sending them something by mail. As Ron was just mentioning, there's going to be a requirement to have lead service line inventories and to inventory where there are known lead service lines, as well as where there's unknown materials. And in the proposed rule, you would have to let people who are serviced by those areas know for the first time within 30 days of creating that inventory, and then annually afterwards, and that can be done in writing. There's also some additional requirements for outreach beyond within the existing rule. EPA has proposed having to give educational materials to customers during water-related work that could disturb lead service lines, conduct annual outreach to healthcare professionals, and also outreach if your system has failed to meet its lead surface line replacement goal. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is a brand new requirement proposed in EPA's rule. They're proposing that community water systems conduct lead drinking water testing in 20% of all K through 12 schools and licensed child care facilities in their area every year. That excludes facilities that were built after 2013. So every school and daycare would have to be tested at least once every 5 years, and the sampling results would have to be provided to the sampled school or child care, as well as whatever primary agency is responsible for implementing these regulations in that particular state and the state health department. In addition, water systems would be required to provide information about the health risks of lead in drinking water to these schools. So again, additional education and outreach materials. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sean to tell us a little bit more about what this is all going to look like in practice.
Great, Ron.
Sean, before you jump in, one administrative note I should have added for folks. There are a set of slides here. Obviously, these are going to be made available. There will note handouts that will be available after the webinar, and so I just wanted to point that out for the benefit of those on the viewing and watching. And so, Sean, turn it back to you then.
Hey, Ron, thank you. Appreciate it. If we go to the next slide, please. So just to orient the audience to American Water, American Water is the largest publicly traded water and wastewater company in the United States. Just to give a sense of where we operate and the size of our system, provide this the map here. As you'll see, we have over 50,000 miles of transmission and distribution mains and pipes, over 80 water treatment plants, surface water that is, 500 plus groundwater treatment plants, and every day we deliver 1 billion gallons of drinking water to 15 million individuals. And so large operations. And so we come to the issue of lead with a cross-jurisdictional view. I need to think about this as it applies, impacts multiple states and different realities in those states. And speaking to the different realities, go to the next slide, please. So I thought this was an interesting slide that would sort of help everyone understand sort of where the lead problem exists. And this is from the AWWA. As maybe many of you know, we estimate there are roughly 6 million lead service lines in the country, but it's not an issue that's equally allocated across the country. You can see that a lot of presence in the middle to the east of the country, the northeast, and as you can probably see from the last slide, a lot of overlap with our existing service territories. Next slide, please. Ron mentioned this a little bit earlier ago, and looks like in conversion to PDF it was a little off, but basically I thought this was a little bit more detail, and I want to thank my water quality and engineering teams for helping provide this slide. But you can see that the U.S. approach to lead in water has been iterative over time, starting over 100 years ago, with the first standard being at 50 ppb. And as Ron and Corinne have very nicely pointed out, we've been on this path to a new rule over the last several years, and we wait anxiously to see what the final rule looks like and what changes EPA accepted, if any, coming out of comments delivered by AWWA and others. And that's something that I think will be important. And as you'll see here, what's one of the key features that Ron pointed towards is the implementation of a 10 ppb trigger action level that didn't exist before. Next slide. So just quickly, I like this graphic, and it just sums up what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this afternoon and what Ron and Corinne touched on earlier, but really 6 key focuses and really designed to improve the health and safety of. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Got a little bit of feedback. Sorry about that.
There you go. Bonus content.
Good. Okay, so anyway, very quickly, key areas, right? Identify areas most impacted. Work on the inventory of lead service lines and find and fix. the strength in treatment, and this is the introduction of the new trigger level, going after those and replacing lead service lines, increasing sample reliability, improving communications, an area that you'll hear we've spent a lot of time working on over the last 5 or so years, and better protect children in schools. That's a new area that really expands under the revision. Next slide, please. So if you reflect back on that last slide, this is American Water's mitigation strategy to lead in water. We've put it together several years ago, and I think it's really 6 lines of defense as we speak to it: to treat, monitor, find, replace, flush, and educate. And we've got significant information around each of those, and we'll get into that in the Q&A a bit, but we are aggressively seeking out and looking to remove lead service lines in our service territories. Next slide, please. I just wanted to touch on, I think one of the things that's most prominent in the revision is the enhanced communication with customers. And I just have to commend our team, our communications team, working with water quality and our engineers, have really built over the last 5 or so years outstanding communication materials to simplify the message, make sure people understand the health risks associated with lead in water, and the process we use to move forward with identifying and potentially removing both our company and customer service lines. And furthermore, what do you need to do once a line is replaced, in terms of post-replacement flushing? Next slide. So what will utilities need? What will we need once the rule is finalized? We're going to need stakeholder engagement in the solutions going forward. We have to recognize every water utility is going to have incremental compliance costs, and that are going to need to be recognized and recovered. And ultimately, this is the huge issue around lead service lines is the funding solutions to eliminate those lines. I'm proud to report that through September of 2020, we have eliminated over 20,000 lead service lines through our water main replacement rehabilitation program. We're moving the needle significantly, but we need constructive legislation or a regulatory environment in multiple jurisdictions. And we've achieved that in places like Indiana, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and West Virginia. And we're really pleased with the outcomes and the partnership we received to tackle this difficult issue. So I'll turn it over to Spencer at this point. We'll come back in the Q&A to some other issues, but thanks for the time.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So you can go to the next slide. I wanted to give just a little bit about the history, because I think the history will tell you why we've done what we've done and then where we need to go from here based upon the lead and copper rules. So Louisville Water Company, we've been around, like Ron said, since 1860. And actually today is our birthday. We are 160 years old today. We pumped our first water to the city of Louisville today. Normally on something like this, we would have a big celebration, and I'm not even sure I would have been able to do this webinar because we'd have probably had a big media event. But COVID, like it's done with everything else, has changed things. So this has been a social media celebration and one-on-one media discussions with our local papers and media. So we're proud of that, excited about that. We're actually chartered in 1854. We do serve nearly 1 million people. And we have a really unique governance structure. We started out actually selling stock as a private entity. Over the course of time, by the early 1900s, the city of Louisville bought all of our stock. And so we're very, very unique in that we are a privately run company, 100% owned by a government, by Metro Louisville. That is chartered by the state of Kentucky and unique in that you can't do that anymore. We were grandfathered in. That happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So we have approximately 300,000 services. The white building there you see on the picture to the right is our National Historic Landmark. That was our pumping station number 1. The source is the Ohio River, and we serve not only the city of Louisville and Jefferson County, we serve all the surrounding counties as well. Next slide. So one of the things that we're really proud of is our rich history. We have a rich history in public health, driving water quality, driving improvements. George Warren Fuller did his first experiments here for the in terms of rapid sand filtration. That has then been utilized across the United States, across the country, across the world. We have actually trademarked our water. We have it, we brand it, we call it Louisville Pure Tap. We've installed riverbank filtration recently in 2010, which is another water quality mechanism. We use the natural, the earth and the soil to help filter the raw water from the Ohio River before we treat it. And as part of that innovation concept, public health concept, we actually began removing lead services in the 1970s. So we've been 50 plus years of working to get the lead services out of our system. And I'll go into a little more detail on that in just a second. So you can go to the next slide. So what do? We have 33 water storage tanks. We have 2 water treatment plants. Both of our treatment plants are designated as Partnership for Phase 4 Excellence. So there's only 18 water treatment plants in the United States that have that designation, at least the last time we looked, and we have 2 of those. So we're very proud of that. We have 66 booster pump stations and about 4,200 miles of pipe. Again, we service 8 total counties, Jefferson County, which is where Louisville's at, and all the surrounding counties. We average about 120 million gallons a day. We have excess capacity. We have about 200 million gallons a day potential, and then, of course, multiple pressure planes. And if you go to the next slide. So I told you before, we pride ourselves on being an innovative company. And we've worked hard on multiple innovations, from our main replacement rehabilitation program, managing our assets, replacing our mains. We started that 30 years ago. We have a condition assessment program for our transmission mains. We have a storage tank asset management program. And like many utilities, you can just go down the list. But in terms of the history of lead, the last known lead was installed around World War II. Most of it was discontinued in the 1930s. But we did find some information that during the war, they did install a few lead services. And so Louisville Water had about 74,000 lead services installed during that tenure from 1860 to World War II. We've never seen a lead service installed in our system in a house built 1950 or later. We just say after 1950. And so we've worked really hard over the last 70 years and are proud to say that we have removed all 74,000 of those publicly owned lead services. We accomplished that back this year, in February this year. Originally, we had a goal back in the early 2000s of removing them by 2015. With the recession and being able to try to have the money to complete that project, we actually moved it to 2025 and then backed it up to 2020, got done 5 years quicker. And so we're excited about that. And in 2016, we also started working with our customers, and we have a private lead replacement program as well, where we will help pay 50% up to $1,500 of that cost. So there's a lot of things that we've done in preparation for this rule, and we'll talk more about that in the Q&A, but to prepare for this, to be in position from a public health standpoint for our customers. And then I guess lastly, one of the things that is prepping for this that we talked about as a group is what are our concerns with the new lead and copper rule? And I'm going to, like Ron said, this is going to be a very high brushstroke, and it's the same concerns I'm sure that most of the people have on this call is, and one of them is the complexity. You know, the complexity of the rule, Ron mentioned that earlier. It is, and complexity in that utilities will figure this out, but in trying to explain the rule to customers, getting them to understand all the nuances, and in the process of figuring out the complexity, there's just so many questions that we had when we originally read it. And trying to figure out the answers to those questions, I think, is going to take a lot of time, and it's going to have to be a partnership between the regulatory agencies and the utilities. Again, I talked about the confusion of the customers. You've got the trigger level, you've got the action level. What's the difference? And I'm looking at it not necessarily from the utilities perspective, but what's the difference from the customer's perspective? Because there's certain requirements for each, and are those requirements appropriate for a trigger versus an action level? And for us, since we've removed all of our public lead services, we have private lead services now. And so now there's requirements for private lead services when the utility really has no capability to enforce those requirements because we don't own the service. It's private property. We can't get on there without permission from the customer. And so it creates a real quandary for us in how to handle and meet some of the requirements of the proposed rule when we don't have any mechanism to be able to enforce those. And then the schools and daycares. We've had a school program. We've actually been working with schools since 1989 in monitoring for schools. And so we've got a school program, but some of the requirements, we've had different success with different schools and trying to work with them on that. And so I'm not 100% sure that putting the onus on the utility for schools is the right place. Should it come through the Department of Education? Should it come through another requirement someplace else where they have to partner with the utility, or maybe it's joint, maybe you have something with joint, but those are just a few. You could, like Ron said, we could get in the weeds and the details, and we all probably looked at 15 pages of questions and issues and concerns. I think the goal of the rule is appropriate. We want to work to get the lead out. We want to protect public health. We want to protect our children. It's just the best feasible mechanism to do that is, which is probably why Corinne said it's going to get challenged in court. There's a lot of different opinions about how to do that. So that's it for me. That's my introduction. So Ron, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks. So that's great. It's always so instructive for somebody like me who's, with an outside law firm to get a chance to hear from and talk with folks who are really having to wrestle with the beast day to day. Let me just pick up from those comments a little bit. You both alluded to this a little. I'm wondering if there's any more you want to add on just generally things that you have been doing within your organizations, either to prepare for this rule specifically or more generally, both with groups that clearly have been quite active and proactive in trying to worry about and think about these things. Anything you have learned from that about overall an approach and strategy you use within your organization to kind of marshal these efforts? Anything that you want to share for the group in terms of, boy, if I had it to do over again, here's one thing we might have done a little bit differently, where people might benefit from that? Kind of a broad, open-ended, just one more shot at lessons learned or observations from what you've already done to this point, since you've both been so active, and in any order, Sean or Spencer.
Hey, Ron, I'll go first, and I appreciate it. Obviously, we've been engaged in this issue for decades, but several years ago, American Water formed a lead strategic action group, or what we refer to as a SAG, to really focus on the science around partial lead service line replacements and what we refer to as the replacement dilemma, specifically the bifurcated ownership of service lines in most service areas. The SAG did look at other aspects of the lead and copper rule, and expanded an otherwise robust customer communications program to further educate our customers about the dangers of lead and the steps they could take to protect themselves. Things we've talked about already: flushing water if it's been stagnant for 6 hours or more. We reviewed our sampling procedures, and we coordinated a review of our system's approach to corrosion control. And just as a point of reference, about half of our operations currently feed a phosphate inhibitor. But significant effort was dedicated to lead service line replacements. We adopted a goal of no non-emergency partial lead service line replacements, and we began to look at the impediments to full service line replacements, including how to fund the replacements of customer-side service lines. And I think Spencer spoke to that a moment ago. To be clear, American Water does not have any systems where we were mandated to perform lead service line replacements. We've taken this effort on proactively. We initiated an enterprise-wide effort to inventory our service lines, and we've made tremendous progress in digitizing these records that should position us well for complying with the proposed revision. That said, we have very limited records with regard to customer service lines. As a result of this effort, we've estimated that we have approximately 150,000 lead service lines throughout the American Water system, which represents about 5% of our total number of service lines of 3 million. We have appointed a lead coordinator in each of our regulated states who oversees and reports on all aspects of the lead program, from the inventory process, construction and main replacement, and communications to our customers. Again, American Water's preferred approach is to replace the customer side lead service line, but appropriate regulatory treatment of such company costs is absolutely essential. We find that replacing customer service side lines as part of our water main replacement program is the most efficient approach in terms of coordinating resources and communicating with the customer. Having appropriate regulatory treatment along with customer approval allows us to retire lead service lines while we are already on site and doing work. And this also helps us better coordinate with municipal road construction and reconstruction work. As Spencer knows better than I do as an engineer, lead pipe is very durable. So if we're working in an era, we much prefer to retire the lead service lines, both company and customer side, while we are there, rather than rebury obsolete pipe to live on for future generations. The lead service lines need to be replaced for water quality, not structural reasons. We have initiated legislative and regulatory education efforts to explain the risks associated with partial lead service line replacements and the need to move exclusively to full lead service line replacements. We have pursued the ability to recover the cost of replacing customer side lead service lines in most of our jurisdictions, and we've succeeded in a number of states such as Indiana and Pennsylvania. We're thankful for that treatment. We continue to pursue fair and appropriate recovery of these costs in all remaining jurisdictions so we can move forward with our plan to replace a significant majority of our known lead service lines within our current service areas by the end of 2030, with an estimated cost range between $600 million and $1.2 billion, which equates to roughly about 5% of our annual construction budget. And I would just point out to the audience that if you're looking for materials in this space, the Lead Service Line Replacement Collaborative has some wonderful materials, particularly in the customer outreach area, that should be looked at and I think could be invaluable. So that's what we've done, kind of piggybacking on Spencer's overview. We are not as progressed as Spencer is at this point, having removed his 74,000 lines, but we are committed to doing so between now and 2030. Thanks.
Spencer, let me take the prerogative of the chair. One quick, follow on to one aspect of Sean's comments there. An aspect of the comments that AWWA put in on this kind of goes to that the wide-ranging dynamics that are state by state that Sean referred to there in terms of the cost recovery element. As he mentioned, there have been some states that have been kind of receptive to the overall possibilities of how you can recover that when you're really doing work on the customer side, what is essentially their private property. I just will point out that other states, there have been both either regulatory decisions from the statewide, utility commissions or from courts that have said, no, you can't actually do that. That represents basically the conferring of a very private benefit to a very particular homeowner as the piece of pipe that they own, and that is thus so targeted and so narrow in the kind of benefit being created that it's not eligible essentially for cost recovery through generalized rate structures. That is a piece of the puzzle, for example, that we put in front of the EPA, who probably is, we think, perhaps a bit naive in the ease and manner by which this can all be done, and somehow the funds magically emerge to support this, basically through some element of more generalized ratepayer or customer-based cost recovery. So throw that in as, it's a perfect sort of illustration of some of the complexities here and one aspect of the rule that AWWA commented on specifically. Spencer, you want to piggyback anything you want to add in terms of lessons learned or additional thoughts to what you opened with there?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but the first of all, all of us knew that the LCR rule was coming. I can probably 6 or 7 years ago, they were talking about upgrading the LCR rule. Now, we didn't know what it was going to be, but we knew it was coming. And so we did several things. The first barrier of protection is your corrosion control. So we invested $30 million in our treatment facilities to try to beef that up, make it more, improve it, but also make it more reliable. And so we did that. You heard me say we removed all of our publicly owned lead service lines. We beefed up our work with schools over the last 7, 8 to 10 years. We've been working with schools for a long time. We expanded that. We've expanded that now to daycare facilities. We're working with them. We now offer free lead testing for anyone that has a request if they're concerned about it. We work with them. You know, we get some requests in, and I think I mentioned before that we've never found a lead service in a house that was installed after 1950. So when we get these calls, we go through a series of steps and work with them on it. And then if they need a test, we get the test. And then if there's an issue, we'll go work with them on the issue. We have the private side component. That's really where it is now getting to be tough. We've worked really hard on the communication, and I absolutely agree with what Sean had said earlier, is communication is the key. Even in working with the schools, if you just send them a letter and say, we're willing to offer this lead testing in schools, you're not going to get the response that if you pick up the phone and you call the right person in facilities and say, hey, look, we'd like to work with you on this. And so it takes time and it takes the right communication. And so we worked really hard to utilize that to try to help people understand our program, to try to help them understand the risk, to try to be an advocate for that. And so we've used all kinds of channels. We right now we're calling everyone that we know that has a private lead service. If we don't, first of all, let me back up. We're sending them a letter, and then if they don't respond to the letter, then we'll make a phone call. If they don't have the phone call, then we send them a postcard, and then we send them a follow-up letter at the end, right? So we're trying really hard to get people to understand what we're offering here, because we, just like Sean said, we really want to get the lead out from all the way. We don't want any partials, but that's a difficult task. And so the public outreach component we've made massive improvements in, and we're proud of that as well. But I'm sure there's always things that we can all do better from that standpoint too. So that's really what we've done, and where we stand. And now we're just waiting for this rule to come out to find out, you know, is all of that enough, or are there other things that we're going to have to do? We feel like we're positioned pretty well, except for some of the requirements on, you know, having to replace a certain number if you have an issue when it's only the private side that's left, right? How do you do that when you can't control it?
So, Spencer, sorry, failed to say happy birthday. That should have been our, you know, the first order of business. And if we'd been better prepared, we would have had, you know, a virtual cake and some streamers exploding for you today. Sorry that we missed that. Let me ask you one. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's interesting. Our communications director, vice president, sent me 3 different emails. Don't forget to mention it's our birthday today. So that was my task to do today.
Well, we'll have the videotape to show them you came through.
That's right.
Let me ask one slightly, you know, different variation on that. I mean, you both sit in very important senior positions within your companies. I mean, just from the position of, you know, being a CEO or being a general counsel, is there anything, you know, specifically that you are that you've been through already that you think, boy, I'm really glad I did that with respect to, you know, the duties I have, or I'm really glad that our company did? Like Sean, you mentioned the SAG group that you put together. It sounds like you feel like that's worked well. I mean, what were if you would, what were some of the components of that for the part of our audience who, you know, is you, who's a general counsel who might be, you know, thinking about doing something like that, and to lead all or some of that kind of effort?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have within American Water, when we have an issue like lead, we often put a team together, a working group, whatever you want to call it. We call it the SAG. that brings a cross-functional team to bear on the issue. And so, legal plays a part, but you obviously have your engineers, water quality folks, your PhDs, and there's some just tremendously talented people on our SAG who've been working on this issue for a decade. Two, I would recognize Suzanne Chiavari in our engineering group and Matt Corson and our water quality team are just outstanding professionals in their space. But bringing that collaborative effort together and looking at the lead issues from all the different angles. Look, frankly, as a lawyer, looking at the litigation that was arising 5-7 years ago, coming out of Chicago and other areas, and thinking about the implications of that litigation on your operations. And so, I think we've been, just like Spencer said, we've been after this issue for a long time. I feel like in terms of things we've done well, we got ahead of. Certainly the lead service line inventory process we began many years ago has really borne fruit, right? To know that we have, roughly 150,000 service lines we have to go get after. We know where they are, and we have plans in place to do that. That will bode well for us, whatever the new rule looks like. In terms of challenges to implement, all I would say is we appreciate the significant effort the EPA and countless shareholders and stakeholders have brought to the table in moving the rule forward. As Spencer said, we knew this was coming for a long time, but the rule seeks to address many complex issues. And we all agree that the focus of the rule on reducing potential exposure to lead in drinking water is critical. And, American Water obviously supports this public health priority. The key, right, is the ability to implement the requirements of the rule, and we believe we can do so successfully. We are, at least I am, interested to see if the EPA has reflected upon the comments that you and others have put forward, AWWA have put forward, because I think they would in some ways help to clarify the revision and maybe streamline it while still improving the implementation of public health protection. So that's what I would speak to. I could talk more detail later on about some of the other challenges we see, but that's what I think we've done well and has stood the test of time.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Spencer?
Ron, I'll piggyback on that too. We just like Sean had said, about 7 years ago we formed a team as well, and it is a cross-functional team. It includes engineering, includes plant water quality, distribution water quality, communication, legal if we need that. It has probably about 12 to 15 members, and it really bore fruit. And I'll just give an example. When we first started, we had I told you we've been removing lead service lines since the 1970s, and we really in the 1990s we had an active program where we targeted lead. We didn't just wait for a main replacement to go in. We actually went in. We call it block renewals because most of the lead was put in certain areas, the older areas in blocks, and so we would go in and remove those. And we used to send our customers what a really good engineer would like, which was just a typed up letter that said what we were doing and what they needed to do. And through that, we really improved the communication to customers. It was easier to read. It was easier to understand. We felt like it was that they would more likely to follow it. We had a lot of one-on-one with our inspectors. We trained them on the information. We put packets together, just really improved that communication component. We also, another thing the team did is we knew the rule was coming, and we knew there might be a component of the private lead. So we had an inventory of our public-owned lead services. We had a really good inventory, but we started to look at and really document the private lead inventory while we're there. And then we implemented this program of helping the customers 5 years ago and really worked to try to get them to replace it. But sometimes they just wouldn't. Even with the offer that we were offering, they, for a myriad of reasons, they just didn't want to. And so, but we at least documented that there was a private lead service there. And so we have that inventory component. And so in working through all of that, working with the engineering group, the team really helped foster a lot of the improvements. It took time, it took effort. Actually, that team still meets. We still meet regularly. We're working with our customers now to get the information out on the private side. That's really the focus. And once we get the final LCR rule, we'll see what additional changes we need to make. And what we're looking at right now, quite frankly, is trying to utilize the technology we've got to be able to help us comply. Another example that the team came up with is you can go on our website and you can type in your account number and determine whether you have a public lead service. We've just now implemented, you can type in your account number to determine if you have a private lead service. And so how we communicate with the customers and utilizing the tools that we have to be a little bit more technical and making sure the data gets back. And there's just, with this rule, there's just so much data that changes hands in so many ways it can change hands. We want to make sure our records are up to date as possible. And so that's what we're focused and looking at now with working with the customers.
That might be a good lead-in. You're talking about all the data and such. Big picture question. You've both made lots of progress. Corinne, you've looked at the rule. And described various of the major components. Just of the new requirements that we've broadly sketched out here. If there's one that, if the rule comes through that in sort of the form we're seeing, have you identified one as, the one that in your mind is going to be the most challenging, either because it's just, hardest because it'll depend on private customer cooperation, or it's hard because it's really going to require a multifunctional approach within your company where you're going to have to bring together a lot of different disciplines? Just anyone that, is most, say it comes out that you're going to flip to in the rule most quickly and say, I want to see what they did here to see whether they made it, easier or harder for us.
Sure.
I tell you what, go ahead, Sean. Go ahead.
Thanks, Richard. I would say that I think there are a lot of areas where comments have been, proposed areas that I think we feel well positioned to work our way through. And as Spencer said earlier, customer communication is so vital. And we've spent a lot of time developing very clear, consistent, multi-step, multi-phase outreach to our customers as we look at the lead issue, whether it's simple lead education or it's more proactively looking to replace company and customer service lines. But one of the more significant changes in the revision is the introduction of the lead trigger level and the actions that must be taken if the 90th percentile exceeds 10 ppb, but is below the 15 ppb. This adds another level of complexity. As Spencer said earlier, we'll work our way through it. We'll figure it out. But I worry about sort of the customer and it certainly impacts different areas of the business very directly: water quality, our operations, engineering, communication. And I will be very interested to take some time, and when the rule is finally promulgated, to clearly understand the nuances of that particular change. Thanks, Spencer.
Okay. So I know I'm a broken record here, but our number one challenge is, since we've removed all of our public lead services, is how do we comply with the rule when we have no ability to enforce the removal on the private side? We can offer a lot. We are already offering incentives, but how do you do that? And that's a real concern for us. We're not sure, and maybe that component will get changed, but we really feel like there would be better means to have homeowners remove that lead service line than trying to get the utility to do it, just because we don't have any mechanism to be able to do that. So.
And maybe I would just jump in, Ron, real quickly there. I think that Spencer is in a very different place than we are. We recognize and have identified 150,000 lead service lines, company owned, and we suspect that there would be customer led as well. And so we feel like as we're moving through our main replacement rehab program, it provides a really efficient opportunity to take the lead out. And so for us, it's more a product of, in each of the jurisdictions where we have lead service lines, getting proper regulatory treatment, cost recovery for that investment. And we think that is an important public health initiative.
Okay, thanks. So I've been,
Hey, Roun.
Quizmaster. Yep.
Hey, Roun. Let me add one thing to that, and I think this is an interesting point too. Is Sean's right, and we are very unique. We're proud of the fact that we've gotten all of our public deadlines out, and I don't know if this statistic's accurate, but when we obviously publicized that to our local community because we wanted them to know all the work that we've done, and one of the articles apparently did some research and said that there were only 7 cities or 7 utilities in the United States that had done that. And again, I didn't look that up. There may be more, there may be a little less, but I think it's fair to say that it's a small number. But the interesting thing is that the situation that we're in, as this rule progresses, more and more utilities are going to get to this situation. Now, it might be 10 years from now, or it might be 20 years from now, but it's one of those things that what we're concerned about, all utilities will eventually be concerned about, or very likely be concerned about, because I think if the other utilities see what we're seeing, even if they have the public side and private, and if they were able to move there and they try and work really hard to remove the private side, they're probably not going to be successful. So when they're done with their public side, they're still probably going to have a fair amount of private side lead services left. And so this is one of those issues that while it only affects a small number of utilities now, in the future, it's going to affect more and more and more and more as we move forward with this rule, whatever it is. So it's just, and I'm not sure how to answer the question. I'll be interested to see what the EPA comes back with our concern. But I do think other utilities will have to face this same issue as we move forward in the years.
So thanks. So just quick reminder for folks there, if there is a question you want to raise, there is a question function and you can send us something. I've been acting as the quizmaster here a little bit. Corinne, anything that you've heard so far that you wanted to jump in on and raise for the group or add as an observation here?
Yeah, Sean and Spencer, you both mentioned that for your systems, you've been able to figure out where the lead lines are and come up with inventories and start taking them out. For systems that are maybe a little bit more behind the curve than yours, do you have any tips or best practices that they should be thinking about as they're getting started on those kind of efforts?
I'll take this one. We actually, as part of our work with customers, we put together a guide to try to help customers how to determine if there's lead. And there's several ways you can do that. When we were looking to determine how many lead services we had, we went and looked in all of course, we started with houses that were earlier than 1950, and then we looked in all of our meter vaults to see where there was lead and help develop that inventory. So one way is to look at your meter vaults, right? You can look in those, or at least for us, was to look in our meter vaults to determine. Another way is many times, not all the time, but many times the lead will protrude into the house. And so you can go in the basement or the crawl space and determine if there's lead. We also offer free water quality testing. Now, that may or may not dictate whether there is a lead service line or not, but it is one mechanism that might be able to help you determine if there's lead. And then the final way, but then you start getting into a lot of cost and destruction of someone's yard, is you can pothole areas, and we've done that before to try to determine if there's lead. If there's a health department issue or we've detected a sample that might be high lead, and we determined that our lead line's been replaced, and we can't find out why, we might do some potholes here and there of the service line to determine if parts of it are lead. And so that's, to my knowledge, there's no mechanism out there that you can go and connect to a service line and be able to determine if it's lead or not reliably. If there were, that would be a great business opportunity for someone or some company. But so there's a multi-pronged approach to be able to do it. And not any one of them is perfect, because there's different circumstances for different utilities. Even us, sometimes the lead stopped 2 feet short of the house, right? And it was copper going into the house, and you couldn't tell that, but you could see it in the vault. Sometimes that the lead wasn't in the meter vault, but you could tell there was something going on because of the even if it wasn't a high level, it was higher than background, and so based upon the sample, we did a little more research and we might have found it. So it is not an easy issue.
I think Spencer hit that issue pretty well. I mean, one of the things that he mentioned, I think you did, is the postcards. We've done that in certain areas, but to my knowledge, you're right. There's no secret technology to determine that. So it's a challenge.
Right. So one of the other things that was sort of really is a bit different or reinforced now is this focus on schools and daycares. I think obviously they are kind of another version of privately held private property and such, but with private ownership or at least different ownership if it's a school district. And that has really emerged here kind of within this rule as an area of concern and where they're giving great force. A little bit different than, I would say what has been the greater focus over the last couple of decades, which has been around either the line that you own that's within your service mains and things, or the homeowner who owns the line, kind of run into the street. Now we've got this focus on a set of rules and very specific targeted sampling and other actions around schools and daycare centers. Can you talk to that? What does that represent as you're looking forward in terms of either set of new burdens or challenges that you're imagining you may face if and when the rule comes through?
Spencer, I'll take that first if you wouldn't mind. I would just say that, yes, under the provisions, water systems will be required to test for lead in schools and daycares, and this is an entirely new requirement. As you mentioned, Ron, early on, every school has to be monitored once every 5 years, or so you're looking at about 20% of your schools each year. As I read the rule, it only requires taking 5 samples per school and 2 per daycare. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that the school or daycare would get to pick the fixtures from which the sample is taken. I would just reflect on in 2016, Congress amended the Safe Drinking Water Act to drop requirement that EPA assist schools and only required to provide guidance, the 3 T's, training and testing and taking action. This new requirement placed on utilities will require some significant logistical planning and coordination on our part that would be new. It's also really important to have clarity in the roles and responsibilities in this area. Clearly, water systems are key allies to schools and child care facilities as they work to address any issues they may have with lead in drinking water. But water systems are not positioned or empowered to take action to address those issues. So it's complicated.
So I agree with what Sean said. To me, the difficulty with this component of the rule is it's a little bit like the private lead service line. They're putting the onus on the utilities, but we have no real mechanism to enforce that or require it or make it happen. To me, it really needs to come through the Department of Education and have that as a requirement of the schools to work with the utilities. And then the utilities requirement is to work with the schools. It needs to be a joint partnership here because, like I said before, we have a school program, so we've been working on that. We've tested many more than just 5 samples in the schools over the last 30 years, but we've had different success with different schools and different school districts in different areas, and it the phone call, I mentioned it before, you need to pick up the phone and talk to them and let them know and understand the risks associated with this and why this is important. But even with that, it has been difficult at times to drive that. We've been pretty successful with it, and the schools have worked with us pretty well. But again, not having the ability to do it and enforce it and require it is just going to make it difficult. It's going to make it hard to happen. Whereas if you went through a different route and required the schools to work with the utilities, then all of a sudden you're in much better position to find out if there is a problem and then make corrective actions if you find anything.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I agree that there's a lot of practical reasons why it probably makes a lot more sense for the Department of Education to be doing this, for it to not be happening through a regulation on public water systems. But I'm also concerned that this is one of the requirements EPA keeps just because of political pressure, since we know that the impacts of lead are particularly, harmful to children, that they're going to want to keep this in just to show that they're really taking steps where they can to regulate those kind of activities. One other thing, Sean, Spencer, I'd be curious for your thoughts on, if you have suggestions to everyone. What kind of planning and training are you doing with your folks inside your organizations right now, getting them ready to have to implement these new requirements, with, of course, the caveat that we don't know exactly what they're going to say. But what kind of staff are you looping in, and what kind of preliminary conversations are you having right now?
Certainly within the community, within American Water, folks who are involved in this issue, water quality, engineering, legal, communications, we're having those conversations. But as you said, Corinne, once the final rule is issued, we'll then assess the scope and magnitude of the changes, and then we'll begin to build a training program for all of the impacted professionals. Honestly, until the rule is finalized, we don't want to necessarily build out the training curriculum because it's frankly premature. That being said, all the stakeholders internally are very focused, and we have built a lot of muscle memory over the last 5 to 10 years in this space that we'll be able to leverage. We're highly confident we'll be able to deliver on whatever the requirements are under the rule, but don't want to go down the path of building out training only to have to sort of pull back later. So we're a little bit waiting to see what comes.
And Corinne, we've done. I talked about the team that we've thoroughly vetted the proposed rule. We understand. We feel like we're in pretty good shape for most of it. Specifically for those things that we have control over, we feel like that we're in pretty good shape. We need to improve in some of our data gathering. We need to do some things differently. But like Sean, we're really waiting on the final rule because we want to understand what we need to do. We don't want to spend a lot of effort on actually implementing anything because that effort may be in vain, right? And so, but we're prepping ourselves. It's all the things that we're doing. We beefed up our communication to customers about our private lead replacement program, potentially because of the proposed rule coming through. We wanted to have that robust and already implemented. We're looking at some of the technology components of making the flow of data go smoother and so that we don't miss anything because of the new rule. And that's good no matter what aspects of the new rule get implemented. So we've done several things. We've made several improvements. We continue to look at it, but we're really just waiting now to determine what exactly we're going to have to do. We still have a school program, and so we're continuing to work with our schools. We continue to take samples. We continue to work on that. But in terms of what we're going to have to do when that comes out, we'll then figure it out and put the necessary policies and procedures in place to make it happen. I know I'm saying this multiple times. I'm just very concerned about implementing something in an area that we don't have any control over. That's our biggest concern. We can have all the policies and procedures and plans and trying to do it, but actually being able to execute it when we have no ability to make it happen is going to be really difficult.
So look, we're coming up on the sort of the witching hour here. Spencer's got important other birthday celebrations, I guess, to get to. Some virtual cake and virtual party hat. So before we sort of wrap up with a couple final logistics, any last words? I mean, you guys have been terrific in terms of really bringing to bear some of the practical experience and insights that you've had already, the things that you focused on in the rule. I hope it's certainly been terrifically educational for me. I hope as well for all of our listeners. I very much suspect that is the case. If there are any final comments you want to offer, I guess we can do that. Otherwise, we'll turn to sort of just close out on a couple of housekeeping things.
Yeah, Ron, real quickly, one thing I'd offer is there's a lot to think about when it comes to the lead and copper rule. One underlying theme that there is a lot of information to gather, track, and in some cases report to the regulator. And to that end, I would want to make sure that everyone is thinking about what they need to do and how they're going to do it and pay for it. And they should also be thinking about how they're going to track and document everything. This goes from inventory to replacements to sampling that goes along with replacements to annual public outreach to schools, daycares, and beyond. I just think one thing we're looking at is a robust tracking system is an absolute priority going forward. So that's just, you have some time, and that's where I'd spend, even though we don't know what the final rule says, building the systems is important. It takes time.
Yeah, and I'll real quick too. I agree with that. And one of the things we really haven't talked about is there is a significant effort on the utilities. There's also significant effort on your state regulators. They're going to be inundated with information that they're going to have to try to track and maneuver through to determine, is everything going like it should per the rule. And we've had a lot of discussions with our state regulators and worked with them on even some comments back to the original rule. And that is a huge issue for our states and how they're going to be able to do that. So it certainly affects us, but it also affects our regulators as well. And then I just close on, lead is a public health issue. We're all in the business of protecting public health. And so we're all very interested in making sure we do everything we can to get the lead out of the schools, of the private side, of the public side. It's really just determining what's the best approach to do that. How best do we go about doing that? And then working to try to make that happen. And there's a lot of things in this rule that are good, but I'm not sure that all the things in this rule are the best approach in making that happen. And so that's what we're trying to share. And then again, it's all about, we've said it before, communicate. Just work with your customers, work internally to make sure everybody understands what you're doing, why you're doing the programs you've got, so that we can all work on this together. It's not just a utility issue. It's a utility issue. It's a customer issue. It's a local government issue. It's a school issue. It's an issue all the way around, and we got to work together to make it happen.
Yeah. And to that end,
great work,
thank Corinne, and your work on the comments that were provided to the EPA, because I think it's really important to raise those issues up and make sure the EPA has an opportunity to consider them. And so thank you for your hard work in that space.
Well, thanks, Sean. One just final quick codicil comment, on the data tracking and things, and one other example of, I think, something that could emerge in the rules, certainly in the proposals, that is a very unusual kind of tracking problem. Some of them are easy things, data and statistics about, what sampling have you done where. But for example, there's at least the possibility the rule will include some carve-outs, like as to or some exceptions to some of the substantive replacement requirements. If you can demonstrate homeowners you have tried and they are uncooperative and it is impossible to do so. Okay, start thinking about the question of how are you going to document and prove that as to this particular household, it proved to be impossible. I mean, it is something like having a record of all the communication, every letter, postcard, other outreach you sent them, and you never got a response. There are some things in there in terms of documentation that are really unusual if you're going to try to ultimately rely on some of these small carve-outs that may end up in the rules. So it's very traditional kind of documentation and record keeping, but potentially some very unusual record keeping requirements as well to prove essentially impossibility of certain actions you might otherwise have taken. So look, I think with that we should turn to the final logistics. I think we may have a slide deck or two about a couple of final things. For benefit of the AWWA, there are some upcoming webinars here related to sort of some related topics. Obviously, PFAS is probably close to a tie with lead in terms of some of the focus and attention it's getting within your space. So there are a couple of things coming up quickly as to that. There's a fuller schedule of what AWWA has available for upcoming webinars at the website location that you see there. Let's see, next slide. Anything else we need to? So obviously, thank you very much for joining us. There will be an archive access of today's program. If you were to have a question or two that occurs to you afterwards, you can certainly feel free to pass that on to AWWA. We'll within the group, somebody will take a look at it. We'll see whether we can provide some additional useful advice or thinking for you. With that, I think that concludes things. And again, very much appreciate your joining us. There are some professional education credits and things that are available. There's information that's been distributed and will be distributed about how you can go about claiming those. And on behalf of the AWWA, thank you for joining us. We'd really appreciate, again, if you hit the survey button immediately following it. And then, as we say, until next time, keep the water safe and secure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.